All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. My name is Hannah. I'm the president of College Democrats at UCF. I'm so glad you all were able to join us today. Today, we have three of our Orange County Sheriff candidates here to answer some questions from the club and then also that we've been collecting from our members over the past few weeks. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, there we go. All set. All right, so I also have my co-host here today is going to be Paola. She's our secretary.
Hi guys, nice to meet you all.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Oh, well, first let's introduce our candidates. So first we have our current Orange County Sheriff, John Mina, if you want to wave. We also have candidate Andrew Darling and Eric McIntyre here joining us tonight. So thank you all for coming, for spending your Wednesday night with us. We really appreciate you. All right, we'll jump right into the questions. So our first question is, why are you the best candidate for this position? Anybody can start. We won't do like...
So I'll go ahead and start. So I am the current sheriff. I've been the sheriff of Orange County for almost 2 years now. I was elected in November of 2018. Before that, I was the chief of police in Orlando for almost 4 years, where I spent 28 years at the Orlando Police Department. So I have going on 30 years of law enforcement experience. And of course, I'm the only candidate that's been the chief executive of the two largest law enforcement agencies in Central Florida. So I'm the one that's best equipped to lead that 2,500 person agency and be in charge of a $280 million budget. While I was chief at the Orlando Police Department, I was able to reduce crime, reduce officer use of force, reduce officer involved shootings, and reduce complaints on our officers by citizens. I was also able to drastically reduce the amount of lawsuit settlements by putting in progressive policies, training, and philosophy, and holding officers accountable. At the sheriff's office, I brought body-worn cameras to the Orlando Police Department, of course, but when I got to the sheriff's office, I brought body-worn cameras there as well, or expanded the body-worn camera program, I should say, and currently working on reforming a lot of the policies that I inherited when I became sheriff. Crime in Orange County is down by 19%. Overall crime is down by 19%, and violent crime is down by 12%. So I'm the candidate with the most experience in this race, and the one who is trusted by the voters in Orange County. Thank you.
All right, so I'll go next. My name is Andrew Darling. I know just about all of you. I think I've seen you guys at least twice in my life. The other candidates candidate McIntyre, Sheriff Mina, we've seen a lot of each other lately on Zooms and other platforms. So why am I the best candidate? We're at a time in our country right now where we have a decision to make. And that decision is, how do we value people in our society? And right now we have a law enforcement community that has sort of doubled down on the policies that they followed for the last 3 decades. And a lot of those policies have gotten us to the place where we are now with mass incarceration and low levels of morale and low levels of trust among the community. I am the only outsider in this race. I am an attorney. I have seen the system work and I've seen the system fail. And a lot of times when you have crimes that are violent crimes and they end up getting dismissed by the state attorney's office, the majority of the times it's because something law enforcement did or failed to do. And I want to focus on making sure that we bring the community and law enforcement together. I believe I'm the only person that can bridge that gap. And what that does is it also makes it safer, not just for the community, but for law enforcement as well. Because at the end of the day, the same way deputies just want to go home at night is the same way the community also just wants to go home at night. So I believe that I am going to be the only candidate that can bring the community together in this incredibly difficult time, and will put policies in place that are going to make it safer for the community and for deputies.
I love this part. That's where I come in and say, I am the better candidate for Orange County Sheriff. I'm Eric McIntyre, and I have over 30 years of legal and law enforcement experience. And I will bring the quality of skills of my years of experience and in community involvement into the community, because I've been working as a volunteer and a mentor, and I'm a real down-to-earth person. I have experience all the way from a tactical team commander, a hostage negotiator, criminal investigations supervisor. I've worked in recruiting, public information. I've been a detective, sergeant, lieutenant, acting captain, interim chief, and chief of police. And the residents of Orange County deserve a proactive sheriff, one that will go out in the community, one that will take officers in to put officers in the community and make for a more united Orange County by getting out of their cars and talking to the people of the community, so that they'll know that it's their community and their voice that matters. Of course, my mission, focus, and goal is to reduce crime, because there has been a high rate and high incident rate of homicides that hasn't been thoroughly addressed. I would say, unfortunately, thanks to I'm not going to say the COVID has slowed a lot of homicides down, because homicides are still up because of the COVID. So other than that, there's nothing that's being done in our communities to reduce the crime. And therefore, if we bring in community policing, what we'll find is more people will interact with law enforcement. And by them interacting with law enforcement, they're able to solve crimes faster. And if a law enforcement officer in the neighborhood, it would definitely reduce the amount of crime, because it's not likely that a person would commit a crime in the presence of law enforcement. And I just want to continue to improve the morale of the law enforcement agency, as well as bring safety to our communities at large, and make for a diverse sheriff's office.
Thank you, guys. Real quick, before we jump into our next question, I forgot to mention, we are going to be taking a couple audience questions. So if you would like to have one of your questions asked at the end of the event, you can either put it, if you're in the Zoom chat, or if you are watching on YouTube, you can put it in that chat as well. Forgot to mention that.
Okay, guys. So what do you believe the role of a citizen review board should be? Andrew Darling, you can go first.
Thank you. So I think that a civilian review board should actually have subpoena power, should have the ability to compel officers to come in and testify, particularly for stuff that does not rise to the level of a crime, right? So if it rises to the level of a crime, an officer or a deputy is going to have the same ability as any other person to assert their Fifth Amendment right and not be a witness against themselves. When this comes to an investigation, when this comes to a civilian review board or a civilian investigatory panel, there's a bunch of different names for them. My position is going to be to change the position of the sheriff's office in the controlling case in the state of Florida, which is Demings versus Civilian Review Board. It came out in 2009. Our now mayor, who was then sheriff, sided with the deputy when the Civilian Review Board subpoenaed him for his testimony. He refused to go. The Florida Supreme Court reversed actually the appellate court and said that no, the sole means by which law enforcement officers can be investigated is the Law Enforcement and Correctional Officer Bill of Rights. So I would fundamentally change the position there and work really hard to change the case law in that particular thing, because one of the first steps to actually bringing trust to the community is to have their input and have them involved. And like, I get it. everything isn't easy. A lot of the folks on the review board are not going to be trained investigators, but that's why you have to make sure that you are supporting your review board with the resources that they need to come to get all the facts of the information. And then it's their time to make a decision. As the way the law stands right now, at the end of the day, it's up to the sheriff. You are the sole body, you are the sole person to decide who is a deputy sheriff under you according to Florida law. But I would not be opposed to a civilian review board having more power, more authority, even up to termination.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrew Darling. I'm going to pass it on to Eric McIntyre.
Citizens Review Board, the name of the Citizen Review Board actually explains what they do. They review as citizens. Because now we have body cams and things of that nature, and they're open to the public, and that's what I'm for, transparency. I find that a Citizen Review Board can look at all the facts and documentation, and once they review all the documentation, if they want to make a recommendation, that's fine. The ultimate decision comes down to the law enforcement agency head that will consider their recommendation and move forward. Should they have subpoena power? The answer is no, because if you're aware of the law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights, the officer has rights to due process, and in a sense, it's a form of a double jeopardy standard. Unless there's new evidence that is known and could be brought in, it's the only reason why an investigation could be open. And even then, it has to go through the steps that were set forth in our laws, which is the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, to properly address it. But the Citizen Review Board does what it says. It reviews. It doesn't interfere. It doesn't bring emotions into a case. For example, when you put a person, an officer, or other witnesses in a review board, you're going to find this. Oh, they're going to be crying, and then that's going to persuade the board to make a harsher decision, as opposed to considering the facts of the case. And if the facts of the case, as written by a licensed and trained investigator, is outlined and is outlined according to whatever the audio and video shows, then they'll make the decision based on those facts, not new facts and not emotions that could come into play inside of a Citizen Review Board hearing. So as far as my concern, citizens should review, and agency heads should make recommendations based on all the facts and based on the Citizens Review Board's recommendation. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to pass the question on to you, Sheriff Mina.
Thank you. So I'm in the unique position of having both the Citizens Review Board when I was the chief of police in Orlando, and now I have a Citizens Advisory Committee as the sheriff in Orange County. And both of those, the CRB in the city of Orlando and the CAC in Orange County, both act the same and have the same powers. And that is, they're basically to kind of bridge the gap between the community and the chief's office, and the community and the sheriff's office, advise the chief or sheriff on policy. So when I was chief in Orlando, the Citizen Review Board made numerous policy recommendations, which I implemented. So they wanted policy changed on our use of social media, so that if officers use that to demean people or say hateful things on social media, that I could terminate them. I listened to their recommendation and put that directly in our policy. The other policy that had a huge impact on at the city of Orlando was they saw, because they review all the internal affairs cases regarding excessive force and conduct towards the public. So in reviewing these cases, they determined that they saw a pattern that some officers appeared to have short tempers and may have been overworked. So they recommended to the chief of police that the number of off-duty hours were shortened in a week, and we implemented that policy. So fast forward to now, the sheriff of Orange County, I use them in exactly the same way. So right now, our Citizens Advisory Committee, and hopefully you had the chance to tune in last night to their meeting, which is posted publicly, they are currently revising our use of force policy, making recommendations to the staff. And so right now they're in the fact-finding mission. They're asking questions of our experts, and they will help determine that final policy. And they've worked on it before as well. So they're going to help craft our final policy based on all the suggestions from citizen input, all the things you've been hearing about through the nation. And so, and the Citizens Review Board, I think there's a kind of a lot of misinformation out there. There are Citizens Review Boards, civilian oversight throughout the nation that have more teeth, as people like to say. But a Citizens Review Board is not a panacea. If you look at the Chicago Police Department, they've had a civilian oversight for years, and that's an unmitigated disaster there. Portland, Oregon has civilian oversight. Oakland, California has civilian oversight, and they've fired like 4 chiefs in the past 5 years. So it's not a perfect system. The beauty of being a sheriff, and one of the reasons I chose to be the sheriff, because as the other candidate says, the ultimate decision on discipline rests with the sheriff. So that's why you don't see sheriffs throughout Florida that have a citizen review committee, because they really don't need one. They have their investigators who are trained to investigate these serious offenses where civilians don't have that training, that knowledge of experience to review evidence and take statements and testimony. And by law, they can't anyway. So the sheriff is the final disciplining authority. And I will tell you that the Bill of Rights, qualified immunity, all these other things that people bring up, that's never ever stopped me from terminating an officer or a deputy because of their wrongdoing. Okay, so the final decision rests with the sheriff. And if you were not happy with the discipline decisions of the sheriff, there's a mechanism in place for that, just like there is for all elected officials.
All right, thank you so much. Our next question is, across the country, some cities have found success using community-based strategies to decrease the occurrences of shootings. If elected, do you plan to implement any of these strategies, or why? And if not, why not? We can go ahead and get started with Mr. McIntyre.
I didn't hear your question. I didn't hear your question. I can't hear you.
Across the country, some cities have found success using community-based strategies like group violence intervention to decrease the occurrences of shootings. If elected, would you plan to implement any solutions like these? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
The answer to that is I would look to bring the community together, and hopefully my community policing plan would work, and it would be a deterrent in the beginning, and it will show that law enforcement officers being placed in the community will interact and work with the citizens in the community, together with clergy, together with programs and that like what you call those faith-based programs, and programs such as the Boys and Girls Club and things of that nature. It helps the majority of the people who are committing the crimes to stay active and to help prevent the crime. For example, maybe we'll have ages ranging from, believe it or not, 16 to about 26 committing the majority of the crimes. And if you can bring law enforcement into the communities and you can help with the mothers, the single mothers that has to work 2 jobs, and the grandmothers who has to watch the children at night, and then they're wandering the street because the grandmas are not actively involved in the children's lives. I think that when law enforcement officers are feeling comfortable and unstressed, they can also go into the communities, pull someone out, and help a family that is in need, and really play a more, I would say, guardianship role in dealing with persons that more likely commit crimes within the community. As far as having community organizations and groups, as long as they're meaningful groups, I have no objection to having anyone come out and help with circumstances and situations before they escalate, and during this time to help them to prevent them from escalating. So I would have no problem with that. And that's been my plan all along, to have the community have a voice, which is my slogan: your community, your voice. And community policing is the way to go, because it's been proven that it works. It just takes a lot of work to do it, with deputies and everyone getting out of their cars and meeting people, and it will work. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Sheriff Mina.
Thank you for the question. So yeah, when I was chief in Orlando, we did partner with the Orange County Sheriff's Office to do a program similar to Operation Ceasefire, the program that has been done successfully in Boston and some other places. We did give a bunch of drug seizure money to a community organization to do this program, and it didn't work as expected. And I think that had to do more with the personnel from the community who were involved. So when I came to the Sheriff's Office, what I did, we started a different program that we basically replicated from Miami. It's called the Walking One Stop. And what that does is it's organized by my office, the Sheriff's Office, and I just hired a full-time employee to do that. She was doing it on a part-time basis. But now what we do is, our last one we did is an apartment complex in south of Apopka. So the Sheriff's Office comes, and we talk to all the residents, and we go door to door. But what we do is we bring the resources with us. We bring people who can find jobs. We bring people who can help find housing. We bring people who can help those get into drug and alcohol treatment programs. The tax collector's office comes. So we have probably about 15 and 16 different community organizations that come with us and say, look, there's violence in this community. We know there's violence. As far as the Sheriff's Office is concerned, if the violence continues, we are going to arrest those who are responsible. But here's what we have for you. We have this person who can help you find a job. We have these people who can help you get into a drug and alcohol treatment program. And so we've had success with that. We are going to continue that program. Like I said, I just hired our employee full-time to do that. So we've done it successfully in Apopka, in Pine Hills. We're also focusing a lot of our efforts in Holden Heights as well. So all those areas that are experiencing some violent crime spikes, that's where the program is focused on.
Thank you. And then finally, we'll do Mr. Darling.
Yeah, thank you. So the hardest part about community policing is it means something different in every community. So in one community, community policing might be walking up and down a neighborhood. If you see somebody outside, you just say, hey, and you keep moving. You try to build a relationship, give them your name, contact information. That may work in one neighborhood. You go to another neighborhood, community policing may be getting folks out of their cars. But because Orange County is so spread out, we have incredibly diverse communities. It's not an easy fix. One of the things, I actually just read a book by, I believe it's David Kennedy. David Kennedy, it's called Don't Shoot. And it talks about programs where you go into communities because the violent crime is happening. And it's generally a very small number of people who are committing multiple violent crimes. So, we have, I think we're at 50 murders so far this year, which is up from 34 at this time last year. And, in my private practice, I have a client who was accused of shooting at somebody, and my client was then later shot. So like the violence in the community right now, the issue we have is this sort of back and forth, right? If we're not able to build trust in the community to solve the first shooting, because most of the time there is a witness. The hard part is if you don't have the trust of the community, if you don't have the community that's gonna, believe that you are either going to continue to do the police work that is necessary to follow up, or and that you're going to protect their interest while they're awaiting trial, they're not going to come forward. And in the time when you cannot secure an arrest because you don't have probable cause yet, because you don't have a witness, when you can't get that arrest, that person's out on the street, and folks in the community know who the shooters were, and they know there's going to be retribution. And that's one of the issues that we're having right now, is you're having this sort of back and forth between one person shoots at one group of people, folks in that group are finding this person a week later and shooting, and then it's going back and forth. We need to get into these communities with members of the community. The reforms that I want to put in place and the reforms that I'm going to put in place, they're not going to be able to be done just by the sheriff's office. Like, these are full community involved. We're going to work with other agencies, other government agencies, other municipal agencies, not just the countywide ones. And we are going to be present, not just physically, but we are going to be present through every agency in these communities. And we're going to let the communities determine what it is that they want to focus on. We are going to enforce the law. That is the role of the sheriff's office. And at the end of the day, when elected, that is still my job, is to enforce the laws. But we are going to give these communities every opportunity to take ownership of their communities with our assistance, with them leading the way, and we are the support. That's the only way we do that, is by building trust. And I do believe I'm the only candidate that's going to be able to do that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Darling. The next question is from Melissa Salceo. Would you like to read it, Melissa?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My question is, how will you ensure that your officers do not target and discriminate against Black and Brown people?
Mina, you can start off with that one.
Sure. So as sheriff, we, prior to officers or deputies even starting, they go through cultural diversity training, human diversity training in the academy. Once they get to the sheriff's office, we do that same training. But what we have put in place is a bias-free policing policy that basically says that you won't treat anyone different based on your race, sex, sexual orientation, your national origin, or your immigration status. And we hold our deputies accountable to that. I've fired officers in the past who have made racist statements. So anytime in that policy, anytime a deputy is accused of racially profiling or hears about a racial profiling complaint, they immediately have to notify a supervisor, and an investigation has to be done so we can look into the matter. What I'm doing this year, we're calling in the nation's leading expert on bias-free policing, is Dr. Lori Friedel. She's going to come in and train all of the law enforcement trainers in Central Florida. So that training will touch every single deputy sheriff. Beyond that, it's important to me that our deputies know that that's not going to be acceptable. And one of the great things that we have now are body-worn cameras, and we are able to determine many times what is happening. You know, our focus is not on people. Our focus is on areas. So where there are certain areas that are experiencing high crime, you will see more activity in those areas. And I did want to clear up a couple things that, you know, first of all, that number of murders is wrong. That's not the amount of murders in Orange County. Violent crime in Orange County is down by 12% as compared to last year, and overall crime is down by 19%. And, you know, we are having our citizens come forward and give us information, and that's why our homicide unit has a homicide solve rate this year of almost 80%. So we have shown that we can work with our community, that our community trusts us. But to wrap up, it's all about holding our folks accountable for their actions, making sure that that philosophy to treat people with dignity and respect, which is part of my mission and vision statement, as clearly documented throughout the sheriff's office, and then holding deputies accountable when they don't adhere to that.
Thank you so much, Mina. I'm going to pass the question to Mr. Darling.
Thank you. So the sheriff just talked about when you police neighborhoods, by default, because we live so segregated, that means that Black and brown people are going to, by volume, have more interaction with the police. There's not a way around that if we continue to police the same way we've always policed. So if we took 10 deputies and we picked any intersection, 10 patrol cars, picked any intersection in the county, maybe not 436 and Colonial because it has the overpass now, but like if you went to Hiawassee and Colonial, if you went out to International Drive when you cross over and get, by SeaWorld and stuff, if you went up to Apopka, if you went to any of these places and put 10 patrol cars there, you're going to have more crime there than you had previously. If you leave them there for a week, there's going to be a record amount of crime in that particular location. It is not always that in Black and brown communities, there is more crime being committed than in other communities. It's that there is more presence to document the crime that is there. So if we look at statistics, every significant statistical study has shown that Black and white people use drugs at roughly the same rate as far as like their percentage of the population. But historically, Black and brown people have been arrested at more than double the rate of white folks. And, Sheriff Mina and Mr. McIntyre, they're proud of their 30-something years in service. And listen, being a law enforcement professional is a proud profession. It should be a profession of honor. It should be something that we appreciate. That profession over the last 30 years has been responsible for mass incarceration, for huge racial disparities in policing. And if we really cared about the war on drugs, like we say we do, we'd spend a lot of time on college campuses, because I bet you there's nobody in this chat right now that's at college that doesn't know where to get some drugs. And I'm not just talking about marijuana, right? But it's all about social control. I'm from here. I'm from Orlando. I graduated from Oak Ridge High School. I care a lot about not just where we police, but how we police. And I want to make sure that we expand the sheriff's office. I do think that Sheriff Mina has done some good things there with some of the data tracking that we're doing. We're talking about encounters, talking about age, race, sex of the individual that you have encounters with. And then you should be able to mitigate down if you're seeing, disparate impacts in your policing. So I do want to expand the data that we collect. I want to make sure that we are tracking all the way through conviction, right? Not just when the sheriff's office says there was a crime, or when the sheriff's office says, we had probable cause to make an arrest, because that's a different standard than beyond a reasonable doubt or till somebody takes a plea. So I want to make sure that we are collecting data and we're following up and we're changing our training and making sure that we're adapting to new laws that are released, because new laws come out all the time, and changes to current laws. I want to make sure that we're doing that, and we're doing that really well. And like I said, I still believe that community engagement is the biggest part of it. And being an outsider, I think that gives me a huge advantage when it comes to connecting with the community and then bridging that gap back to law enforcement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Darling. I'm going to pass it on now to Mr. McIntyre.
Okay, I'm allowing my brain to recycle and stick with the question. In the Black and brown communities, you may say crime is up. I had an interesting conversation with a young man one time. He says, McIntyre, why you always used to follow me, and why you always just pull me over and things like that? And why don't you just go over there to those white neighborhoods and do that? I said, well, see, the difference is usually if I'm stopping you, you have a tail light out, and then I'll arrest you or something for your driver's license, because you don't keep your driver's license up. And they do. They check their vehicles. Maybe their vehicles are newer than your vehicles. And then you smoke marijuana in your car. So that is why you're going to jail, or that's why things has happened. So the disparity in that is usually those that commit the crimes, those are people that hang out on corners. And those are easy investigations because you can monitor who are sellers and who are buyers. In gated communities, they don't hang out on porches. They don't hang out. They pretty much do it in a very concealed way. So the problem of drugs in neighborhoods happens in every neighborhood. So it shouldn't be a surprise. It's just unfortunate. It's just unfortunately the problem in some Black communities are that they don't own their houses and they don't have gated communities and people are hanging out. And what we want to do is the more people hang out, the more you want a law enforcement officer to be present in that neighborhood. As far as meeting the needs of the Black and brown community, place officers in the community that can relate to the culture of the people. So let's not get that wrong and say, okay, just put Black people in Black neighborhoods, put Hispanics in Hispanic neighborhood. No, it pretty much means regardless of whom you are or who you are in uniform in a neighborhood, you want the community, you want the officers and the community the officers to make up the community, but you also want them to know that all officers are positive and all officers has good intentions. The elderly ladies that make those phone calls that are afraid, the mamas and other people that are afraid in communities, what you'll find is they'll come and say, please take these people away because they're causing problems. And that's what I want to do. I want people to be able to say, hey, take this element of crime out of my neighborhood. You're not going to find that in Aliquot. You're not going to find that in these Ellsworth. You're not going to find that, hey, there's drug dealing going on. You're not going to find that type of those type of calls that's being made. So that's why undercover units help out in monitoring where the quantities are coming from. But it starts through the inner city. You're making the more money pretty much through the inner city. And then that's why we make these graphs that says, okay, it started with this one traffic stop for a tail light that led to 10 bags. And then we followed that person and monitored that person. And then it came out to become bigger and bigger quantities until we get the major person. So as far as the Black and brown communities and their disparities, yes, we want the sheriff's department to make up for the community because a lot of people don't speak Spanish. I see things go across my mobile data terminal computer a lot that says, hey, we're looking for a Portuguese speaker, we're looking for a Haitian speaker and things of that nature. So we need to make it very diverse and we need to go into communities. And I say we as law enforcement and law enforcement administration would allow for us to go into communities to learn what their needs are and to learn how they feel about law enforcement, and as well as provide training for law enforcement early on so they'll understand the diverse of cultures and diversity of communities. So we can do that and we can work together with communities. We can change the outlook of how we look and what we understand about communities, because every country is different, every neighborhood is different, and we patrol our areas accordingly.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is specifically for Mr. Darling. So voters value experience on the job. Seeing as you don't have any law enforcement experience, what qualifies you to be sheriff?
No, absolutely. So I'm the only candidate in this race that the Florida bar says is eligible to practice law. So there is a huge priority in law enforcement, and oftentimes that priority focuses on enforcement, right? And that enforcement is absolutely part of the job. But if you do not perform that enforcement in compliance with the law, you're not going to be able to keep violent criminals off the street, and you're not going to be able to stay current on what the most current search and seizure, what is an exigent circumstance, what is an exception to the warrant requirement. So there's all these things that oftentimes we expect deputies and officers to know that folks like me went to school for 7 years for, and you're supposed to learn it in 4 months at an academy on the job training. And like a lot of times it's not realistic. So we're going to need somebody who both understands the law in its most complex, but is also able and who's had the experience in the military. I've been to Iraq twice. I've had to make those decisions of shoot, don't shoot. And I've made both of those decisions in my life. So when officers say, well, you've never done a traffic stop, listen, if the sheriff is out doing traffic stops, I don't know how many traffic stops Sheriff Mina's done in the last 2 years, but if the sheriff's out doing traffic stops, the sheriff's office is in a lot more trouble than it needs to be. The sheriff is a position of the executive of the 9th largest law enforcement agency in the South. I have the experience, I have the credentials, and I am capable of doing this. Like I said, I am an outsider. Everybody else is either a career law enforcement officer or we have a law enforcement academy graduate. Like, I am the outsider. I am going to be able to bring in a perspective that none of the other candidates can bring. I am also from here. I am from a neighborhood that has been over-policed for decades. Sheriff Mina did the right thing back in November, I believe it was, when he had to terminate a deputy for an instance just outside of Westridge Middle School where a young girl was snatched by the back of her hair. And the deputy was the person who was actually escalating the situation. One of the other deputies had it under control for the most part. And that's 2 miles from where I grew up on Americana. Like, half of the people that I graduated high school with went to Westridge Middle School. I happen to go to Walker. So, like, I know this community. I am familiar with this community. I have the credentials. I have the experience, and I am ready to lead the Orange County Sheriff's Office on day one.
Thank you so much, Mr. Darling. The next question is, would you, and if so, how, seek to demonstrate that the sheriff and his office balances rigorous enforcement of the rule of law with compassion and respect for all residents of that county? That task may be more difficult for the next sheriff than the one before. Why do you believe that you would be good at it? I'm going to pass it to Mr. McIntyre.
History has a way of repeating itself, and it mentions that we've been knowing that for years. It mentions in the Bible what was before will be again. Normally, what happens is based on the history of law enforcement and the history of all this racial injustice. It's been going on for a long time, and it seems like it's coming back again. To highlight the point of what I would do different is, I think when we come into a community, again, we have to shine. We have to have them and people in the community see us as law enforcement officers, and we're just here to do that job. We're also here to allow for people to bounce things off of us. I can only look at our community and say, I want to do the right thing, and I know we can do better. But usually what happens is people follow the leader, and the leader is saying, hey, good job, don't worry about that complaint. Then people become more and more complacent. And not only do you have the leader, you have the person that's under you. You have the commanders, you have all the commanders, and it trickles all the way down to your sergeants and corporals. When you sit them in a room and say, this is what I expect, then they know that if the officers under them are not following the rules and they're not making for a great Orange County, or they're not treating the citizens properly, then they know that they're then responsible for everything that the officer does. And what I've known in my experience as a law enforcement officer, I can tell you which officers will do something and which officer will not do something. I can tell you which ones that we'll have to monitor more and which ones we have to talk to for various reasons. But again, you still have the idea that as a leader, you have to let your officers know what it is that you expect of them. And by by letting them know what you expect of them, you'll bring about a lot of trust. The morale goes up, and people know that I enjoy coming to my job because I know that every complaint that comes in is not a bad complaint on me. It's just somebody did it because they want to beat a case. And I'm pretty sure in the courtroom, there have been people who say the officers did this and they did that only to get out of their case. And it happens. You'll have to have a ride along, not for a week. Try about a good 2 or 3 weeks, because during that week, you may not encounter a bad guy. people curse me out in the Black community and call me Uncle Tom's. They call me the white man, because only thing I'm doing is coming in there and trying to solve crimes and make people happy. And then when they get in trouble, the first person they call is the law enforcement agencies. So in response to that question, I find that if you make for great leadership and people can trust you and they know it's coming from your heart and they know that you mean business, they'll do the right thing. And then it will reflect who you are within the agency, which also would reflect in the community that these officers are out here doing their job, as opposed to just doing whatever it is that they want to do. And we're human too. We are human too. We have emotions as well. And it's nothing like chasing the bad guy for 4 blocks. I'm sorry, did I say 4? More like 15 blocks, jumping gates. And then when you finally catch them, they want to struggle. And you might say some words out of the way that you might say, oh, well, I really didn't mean it. It's just because I was upset. And then you say, okay, is that really worth discipline? If they don't drop a weapon and you repeatedly tell them to drop it and they don't understand the common words of please, sir, thank you. And then all of a sudden when you say a derogatory word, they seem like they want to drop it and now you're in trouble because of your emotion. And it had nothing to do with who you are as a law enforcement officer or pretty much as a person. It's just sometimes people only respond to certain languages. So with all due respect, I just think that as a law enforcement officer, they're going to follow the lead of the leader. And training is going to help us be better people and help us interact with the community.
Thank you so much, Mr. McIntyre. I'm going to pass the question now to Mr. Darling.
So we know that the next 4 years are incredibly important years in the relationship between law enforcement and the community. I've been in the community. I grew up in this community. And right now, if the community supported the current sheriff in the capacity and in the role that he's played, there probably wouldn't be 4 other people running for his job right now. The deputies recently pulled their endorsement. The FOP pulled their endorsement from Sheriff Mina. And it's not about him being moderately, occasionally progressive on a couple discipline issues. It's about he made campaign commitments going into the 2018 election that he has failed to live up to. And that is to the deputies. That is to the thin blue line who throughout his career, he has been a part of and he has protected, even in instances where an objective outside observer would not have. I'll give him all the credit in the world that in some of those instances, his hands were tied related to union contracts and whatnot. And he did try to make some strides to fill the holes that allow those bad officers to remain on OPD. But in order for us to move forward in the climate that we are in right now, the reason I'm the best person is I've been at these protests. I've been at them, one, as a legal observer. In my role as an attorney with my law firm, I represented nearly 20 peaceful protesters pro bono, and every one of their cases has been dismissed. So I am on the front lines. I had somebody ask me, so, well, if you're so much of a part of the community, what happens if you're not successful in this race? I said, then I go back to my law firm and I continue to represent clients in this community. And I continue to do not just criminal defense work, but rights restoration, sealing and expungements. One of the things that we don't talk about that I want to start at the sheriff's office is I want to have an actual sealings and expungement unit. What that does is when somebody's arrested and for whatever reason, the state attorney drops their case. So if that person completed pretrial diversion, if they completed a diversion program that the sheriff's office has, or if they, for whatever reason, the case was dismissed against them, maybe they had probable cause to arrest, but not enough to get a conviction. We at the sheriff's office will assist that resident with the paperwork to get the sealings and expungements processed. And what it's going to do is it's going to allow our deputies to be trained on, oh, these were the 3 or 4 things that if I would have done differently, we would have actually gotten a conviction in XYZ case, right? So everything that we do has to involve training, and everything that we have to do has to include the community. And I do believe that I'm the best candidate that is going to engage the community. And like I've said previously, bridge that gap that is there right now and will likely continue to be there if we elect a career law enforcement officer to stay in this position.
Thank you so much, Mr. Darling. I'm going to pass the question now to Sheriff Mina.
Sure, thanks. So it all comes down to three things, philosophy from the sheriff, good training and good policy, and we have all three. My focus as sheriff has been reducing the amount of violent crime in our community, which we have been successful with. Our violent crime is down by 12%, and engaging with our community. So what I tell our deputies when I first got there is I want community engagement on steroids. And all one has to do is look at our social media, and you will see everything that we are doing in the communities, from community barbecues to food drives during the pandemic, to our police athletic league, to our civilian police academy, to all the things that we do. But it's not just about those formal community engagement programs. It's about the informal community engagement programs. And so what I tell our deputies is sometimes those are more powerful. Tell a child that they're smart. Stop and play catch with a child, when you have free time. And those interactions are happening every single day. And this community knows that. They have seen that when I was chief in Orlando. They see that now that I'm sheriff. And I hear that all the time. Thank you for all those great things you guys are doing in the community. And then, focus on violent crime. Don't worry about numbers of arrests or numbers of contacts. Worry about results. Worry about making neighborhoods safer. That's what it comes down to. And that's the philosophy that I share from the top. And so just to kind of go back, since the other candidate brought up the FOP, the 50 members of the FOP voted to pull their endorsement from me. And what that comes down to is they are upset with me for harsh discipline I have levied, terminations and suspensions that I have levied for excessive force cases. And they're not happy with me right now on that. I was able to give them one of the biggest raises in Orange County history just recently, their first contract. But morale will improve, when the pandemic is over, when some of the unrest has stopped. But I will not apologize for kneeling with protesters. The FOP is upset about that. I will not apologize or be intimidated or bullied by the Fraternal Order of Police because they think my discipline is too harsh. I have a strong record of holding officers accountable at the Orlando Police Department, and the FOP there was upset with me too, and that did not deter me. So when I get here to the sheriff's office, I saw some things I didn't like as far as discipline. I increased discipline in cases that needed that. And some, especially the FOP leadership, are not happy with that. And how do I know that? Because I met with them and they told me face to face why they're upset. So I'm going to continue to work with them. I've agreed to have lunch with the FOP president once a week to work out our differences, to work to improve morale. But again, I'm not going to be bullied into lessening the amount of discipline and holding our deputies accountable. But to wrap up, training, the philosophy from the top, community engagement on steroids, and having good policies and procedures and operations in place to prevent and reduce crime in our neighborhoods.
All right, thank you so much. Our next question comes from Gabby Hagan.
Hi, so in light of recent events, do you support the use of tear gas and other crowd control measures we have seen recently on protesters? If so, why? If not, why not? And what are some possible alternatives?
We'll start with Sheriff Mina.
So again, going back to my time as chief of police in Orlando, I marched alongside protesters in 2016. And I've let protesters block intersections for hours, let them lay down in front of the Amway Center, despite there being an event there, because I believe in the right to peacefully protest. And what I've always said for these past 6 years as chief and as sheriff now, what I've always said to the community, to peaceful protesters, and to the media is that you have the right to peacefully protest. The two things that we will not tolerate in this community are damage to property and violence. And as soon as those things occur, law enforcement needs to take action. And the use of tear gas, and we'll go back to the recent protests, although the Orlando Police Department was in charge of those protests where the tear gas was used, that was only in response to rocks and bottles and bricks being thrown. Several of my deputies got hit with rocks. I don't know if you've ever been hit with a rock before. It's not a pleasant experience. One officer was hit so hard with a brick that it broke his face shield and then broke his nose. So we're not going to tolerate violence towards our community. And remember, law enforcement officers are our community. And one of the things when I went out to one of the protests at the Orlando Police Department this past couple months, and yeah, I did kneel with protesters to try and show some solidarity and really talk to them and listen to their needs. You know, and unfortunately, in only some of the protests, people took it upon themselves to commit violent acts, and tear gas was used. So I would only use tear gas in the most extreme situations, and we won't use rubber bullets like some other communities have. But tear gas, although an irritant, does not cause any permanent injury. And so kind of going back to the protesters that the other candidate had talked about, all those charges were dropped by the city prosecutor. So I think that was something that's done by the city to say, look, it's over, we're done. We don't want to prosecute you any further. The issue was solved that night. And if you remember from some of the news stories, I saw some of the things, there was a very, very small group of people that came to disrupt and cause violence. People came with knives, slingshots, hammers, bricks, and it was a very small group. But if you watched as the protests progressed, and as it was my opinion to kind of get out of the riot gear, dress down a little bit, be on the periphery, and not have that line of officers or deputies. And I think that helped. And so you saw as the protests, as we had one more and more each and every day, there were less and less arrests. And the mayors agreed to lift the curfew, and we started to have less and less problems. So I think this community has always been agreeable to peaceful protests, but where we draw the line is property damage and violence that is committed on people in our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next I'll pass it along to Mr. McIntyre.
I'm all for the freedom of speech, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, the right to protest. I'm all for that. I do believe that our rights, we're supposed to enforce the rights, and we're supposed to give them the rights to do it. And you notice that it says to peacefully protest. It doesn't say that there are some people that come in there, rebel rousers, or they'll come in there and just say, hey, this is an opportunity to go and hit that jewelry store. I like that lawnmower, that drill set down the street, so I can get it because the police are on the other end and they can probably get away with it. The question that you asked is, would I be for tear gas or using these type of devices on crowds? You do that. The answer to me will be, well, let me tell you, before I say yes, I want to say, when it gets out of hand, maybe some of the people that surrounding the bad guys would help law enforcement officers subdue those people so that they would know that that's not the right thing to do. Other than that, that's part of the problem. They become a shield for everyone, and now we have to break it up. And now we have to break it up. And many times you'll find that an arrest will be sufficient. So why go further? Because I have an example of that. Whereas I was holding someone at gunpoint, and it was a high intense situation. The person is down there loading a gun, loading the gun. I'm giving the loud verbal commands, and then there's someone on the other side distracting me and distracting the other officers. And once that situation was over, they continued to do it. So because they were intending to incite a riot, they went to jail. Then I get this nice letter from the state attorney. The arrest was sufficient. Well, yeah, to take them out of the situation. That's our main goal, is to take them out of the situation and prevent them from harming others and the property of others. So yes, in circumstances such as that, I would say that the implementation of tear gas would be appropriate. And so it based on the totality of the circumstances, what force you use, and that will be whatever force is necessary to calm the situation and or to affect the arrest. And so I would agree.
Thank you. And finally, we'll move on to Mr. Darling.
So I feel conflicted, but mostly by Sheriff Mina's answer. So to say, we support peaceful protesters and we let people lay down, we let people protest in the street. It's not about letting them. That is their right to do that. And talking about the sheriff and Chief Rolone showing up in their regular duty uniform is different than having hundreds of deputies and officers out there in full riot gear, actively escalating the tensions during a protest. I walked, and I have the video somewhere. Somebody sent it to me. It was on West 2's helicopter. There was a pretty intense standoff is probably the wrong word, but there was a pretty intense position where OPD blocked off a road so that protesters could not go any further on that road. OPD was doing their best, along with the sheriff's office, to steer the protest in a particular direction. Part of the protest broke off and went a different direction, and OPD refused to let the protesters go across the street, which in that particular instance, because the protesters were in the road and they were not on the sidewalks, that is likely the right decision. That probably goes in line with whatever the operational plans were that OPD and the sheriff's office had related to the protesters. To watch specifically OPD not just put their mask on, but do all of the different body posture, all the different things that are like the very beginning parts of the escalation of force that you have, being loud, being present, making yourself bigger than you normally would be, standing with certain postures, and then to put their mask on, to actively shake up their cans of whether it's pepper spray, tear gas, whatever you want to, they're different entities. So each officer could have a different particular thing, but they have these thumb triggers on them. So it's basically you're holding a handle and the bottle is like in here and your thumb is the trigger. So when you put your thumb down and spray, you can do that. And to have the officer standing there and like very intentionally sort of waving their hands down by their waist, trying to, it felt more like they were trying to incite the protesters, who were mostly young people, very verbal and vocal about their anger. And I'm there walking back and forth right in between them. And there's probably a 2 or 3 foot gap. And I'm walking right in between them, telling the officers, listen, like, you can calm down. Like, we're good here. Like, I get it. But like, I also know most of these protesters. And for me, tear gas is an absolute last resort. OPD has, I believe it's a 4-step use of force policy, and a chemical agent is part of the first step. It doesn't need to be part of the first step. If you're using it in a defensive mechanism, if you're using it, the only offensive mechanism that you should be using tear gas is when you are moving in to protect somebody else, and in some instances, somebody else's property. I mean, but you obviously value people over property in every scenario. And if you have to go in to protect another resident, another citizen, or if you have to go in and protect another officer or deputy, like, I do think there are some instances where tear gas is proper, but it obviously should not be used flippantly, and it should not be used as sort of the first part of your use of force.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Darling. The next question is kind of two questions in one. So according to the Orlando Sentinel, 63% of sworn deputies were white, while only 39% of the county is white. Do you think a majority white police force can effectively protect and serve a majority minority community like Orange County? And besides benefits and salary, how can we ensure minorities are comfortable enough to work in this field? I'm gonna pass that on to Mr. McIntyre.
Okay. Well, they say that the love of money is the root of all evil, but money answers all things. And in law enforcement, you have to understand that we're counselors. We're counselors. We go and we talk to people about civil disputes. We don't always just go on the scene to arrest people. We have to change our ball cap every traffic stop. There might be an old lady that's just saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that," and it's not up to us to wave our finger at them. And then on the other hand, you'll find that you'll do a traffic stop and then it's a hostile person and then you have to put on another cap. Well, that's good. That's what we call stress. And by stress, you don't take that home to you. You take your paycheck home and then you make sure that your family is taken care of. And if you want officers to do a great job, again, it's not really about the money. It's about whether or not they're paying their bills, but it's not about the money now. It's about how happy they are on their job. Whether or not they'll say, "Oh, don't worry about that hour overtime. I'll just do this because we need it." And when you find that, and I'm getting away from the question just a little bit, so I'm just gonna point this out, that you're going to find that when you have a law enforcement officer that says, "Well, it's not about the money, it's about me doing my job, and I just want to go home safe, and I want to protect people, and I want to protect my other officers," and that's what it's about. The disparity is what I said about putting people in communities and making a sheriff's department that makes up the community. You want diversity. Unfortunately, is a lot of times when you're growing up I'll take it from my experience growing up, I've had some dealings with law enforcement as far as, okay, why are you making contact with me? I was at the state attorney's office visiting some investigators when I was 14 years old, and as well as the then Lawson Lamar, and I was only 14, and this MBI guy comes and asks me what I'm doing there. They had no idea I was visiting, who I was visiting. Then next thing I'm in a chokehold or something, and then those are some of the things you have to report on your application. And then once you report that on your application, they'll say, "Oh yeah, no, you're not really a good fit for us because you had police contact," not knowing the totality of the circumstances. There were no arrests involved in that, but it's just the mere fact that you had some type of police interaction. And that's what's happening and why some minorities may not get the job, because people are looking for the perfect person. And when you're looking for the perfect person, you're going to find the imperfect person, because anybody that hasn't thrown rocks as a kid, who hasn't done pranks, who hasn't put Dawn inside of a water fountain and watch it bubble, then those are not the type of people I'm looking for. I'm looking for those type of people, real people that can have fun, not the ones that's in essentially lying and saying, "Oh no, I've never thrown a rock." Then that means those are the ones you have to watch out for, because they're hiding something. And that's why the hiring disparity is what it is, because you're looking for the perfect person. Unless you committed some type of high crime, or you committed some type of crime that's in violation of the standards that we have for the criminal justice standards of training, then more likely you can be hired. So I believe that the disparities in the hiring is the problem. How to make up for those disparities is sometimes you need to change in administration. You can have a change in administration. You also need to have a specialized recruiting unit that can see right through some of the people that want to be candidates. And as a recruiter, I'll tell you this: There are people that used to come in, I'll sit on the panel, and they'll have a nice record, and I'll sit there and my instincts will kick in. It's like something about that person just isn't right. I just don't know what it is. And then the next thing you know, I'll see this person. I say, hey, who is that guy? Because I don't know who he is. Something about him is not right. Next thing you know, he's out there running traffic with me, and they call him to the police department. And he has a history of showing race cars in magazines to Boy Scouts. So I say, okay, now this is not the type of person that. And then that day he was terminated. Because sometimes you have to look at, and it's a collaboration of what you feel and something about people that you have to dig a little bit more about, even through psychological evaluations, in order to put them on your police force. So it's a lot more than just. There's a lot more than just looking at a person or an agency and say, well, we need to increase the percentages of this, that, and the other, because we don't know what the total makeup is. It's more whites in Orange County than there are Blacks and Hispanics. So I think the sheriff's office is made up proportionately of the right group, or the right group of people, but we need to make it more people in our neighborhood that reflects the neighborhood, in addition to the people that are white, put them in the Black neighborhoods and let them feel what it's like to have to behave. And I'll tell you, Orlando Police Department used to send all the people that had issues to the airport. Why? Because when you mess up at the airport, that's it. You can't do anything but be nice. And that's like a reverse house arrest in a sense. It's like, now you be up, if you do wrong to the tourists, yeah, you're out of here. So you have to look at the totality of the circumstances, and I think that the disparities and the percentages within the sheriff's department needs to be. It can be increased, but you have to look at who was there a long time and who's the supervisors that's been there that allow people to get away with a lot of things. And you have to look at those things, because I can tell you, I've been in environments where I thought I could, I shouldn't have gotten this happen to me, or why are you reprimanding me this for this? And then everybody else look at you like you're the bad person. And I just think we have way too much time to answer these questions. So, and I do thank you, everyone for your patience. But having more diversity in the sheriff's office would help, and having training for diversity would help with in recruiting also. And just being a little bit more lax, but at the same time be a whole lot cautious of the perfect people, and bring in some people that doesn't have issues in their background. Thank you.
Oh, okay, thank you so much, Mr. McIntyre. I'm gonna pass this question now to Sheriff Mina. Do you need me to repeat it?
No, I'm good. So
I addressed that first.
The law enforcement agency, the Orange County Sheriff's Office, in a perfect world, needs to reflect our community exactly. I just got there. Our previous sheriff was an African American from this community, and I know that is one of the things he worked hard on. And I will be honest with you, it is something that law enforcement agencies in metropolitan areas continuously struggle with. So that's why we're engaging with the community like never before. All of our recruiters go on trips to historically Black colleges and universities. We go to military posts and installations, because the military is one of the most diverse organizations in the world. And so we're reaching out to our African American community, because those are the numbers that we're specifically hurting in. So, as more and more Hispanics come to Central Florida, I will be honest, our focus has been on that. So 1 out of every 3 deputies that I've hired is Hispanic, because the increase of people coming here from Puerto Rico after the hurricane, people, especially Hispanics, are flocking to Central Florida, specifically Orange and Osceola counties, and we need to keep up with that. Specifically, so we need deputies who are bilingual. So a lot of our focus has been on that, and the numbers will reflect that. 1 out of every 3 deputies we hire are Hispanic. So where we are lacking is in hiring African Americans. And so one of the first things I did, one of my first appointments when I became sheriff, I appointed Under Sheriff Mark Canty. He's an African American who grew up in Pine Hills, and I gave him that position because he's the most qualified person that I know, and I trust him. And he knows my philosophy because he came from the Orlando Police Department. But what I also want to do is show people from this community that a kid from Pine Hills can become a law enforcement officer and can be second in command at the Orange County Sheriff's Office. So we work really hard to recruit in our African-American communities. And that starts with all the community engagement activities we do. We go to job fairs, any community activity we do, whether it's a barbecue or whether it's a food drive, our recruiters go there with us to ensure that we are getting the best people. One of the things we're looking at right now is an incentive for all deputy sheriffs that hire qualified applicants. We'll give them an incentive, whether it be time off or money, to increase those numbers and help us better reflect our community. So for brevity's sake, I'll end there. We definitely need to reflect our community, and we are working hard in that respect.
Okay, thank you so much, Sheriff Nina. I'm going to pass the question now to Mr. Darling.
Yeah, so it's one thing to have the Orange County Sheriff's Office reflect the community. It's a bigger thing that we need to focus on, which is the culture of policing. So it does not matter if you have a force that is directly proportional to the population if that force is still disproportionately impacting Black and brown neighborhoods. So it's one thing to say we want to be the same, and I agree, we do. Like, we want to be much more proportional to the actual population. There's a lot of other advantages because of that comes with cultural competence, language proficiency. We're an incredibly diverse community here in Orange County. I mean, I can think of at least 20 languages that are pretty prevalent here in Orange County. I mean, the major ones being, of course, English, Spanish, Haitian Creole, and Portuguese as well, because we have a huge Brazilian population here. And especially when you're down on, International Drive and talking to tourists, it's important to have people that can speak to folks in their native language. What I would say is I want to focus a lot on retraining, and the people that we do have, we want to try and get some of them proficient in other languages, right? So that's going to cost money, but cost dollar for dollar, it's going to be cheaper than spending incredible amounts of money to go recruit in other places. So we are going to also heavily recruit from HBCUs. Here's the problem that you're going to run into, though, is if you're coming out of college, if you're a young Black professional, what is the incentive to go to law enforcement, right? Like that's sort of the question. What is the incentive for you? And I think we need to create a culture that shifts the purpose of policing. Your job is service. Yes, you are a peacekeeper. Yes, you need to solve violent crimes, but your job is service. And we need to focus on the service side of it and how we work through not just hiring, not just the background check process, but retention and what we focus on as marks that we're going to use for promotion and growth inside. Those are things we all need to focus on. Of course, you want to have a diverse force. Of course, you want that force to represent the community, but it's the culture change that needs to happen. And for that culture change to happen, you have to have somebody from outside of the career of law enforcement.
Thank you so much. Okay, our final question comes from an audience member. So the question is, qualified immunity only allows suits where officials violated a clearly established statutory or constitutional right. In practice, this often means that officers only face repercussion for their actions in instances where a precedent has been set. In my view, the system unfairly grants law enforcement officers privileges other citizens do not have and prevents the serving of justice if cases do not neatly conform with previous instances of abuse. Do you agree with this analysis? If not, why not? And if so, what can be done to remediate this issue? We'll start with Mr. McIntyre.
Qualified immunity is pretty much just not like diplomatic immunity in the sense. It's one of these things that says, I am affecting arrest. A person got hurt in the process, and it seemed like that was the best thing to do at the time. Don't jump and there should be steps and parameters before we decide to say a person violates somebody's rights. You have to look at the big picture. You have to look at the whole totality of the circumstances. It could be previous history of a law enforcement officer or whatever the case may be. But as far as sovereign immunity is concerned, that's all law enforcement officers, that's all they have. They just have because in that case, suits and lawsuits will be out of control. We'll be selling left and right. Even though we did things we tried to do things the right way, whether it was training and everything of that nature. I don't think that you should stop qualified immunity in circumstances where the officers did not have any intent to do anyone any harm. But when you have an intent to say, hey, why did I grab the person's hair and push their head in the concrete and rub it on the ground? That's not a law enforcement technique. That's a crime. And that's where you cross the line. But you need some protection because, as I mentioned earlier, there are people that will come down and they'll tell the internal affairs something that the officer did that's not the truth because they want to get out of a complaint. And body-worn cameras are good for law enforcement officers at times, and they're not so good for law enforcement because it doesn't allow for you to effectively do your job. And as an example of that, if you catch someone with some marijuana, it's like, oh, I really want to let you go, even though it's under 20 grams, but then how is that going to look on this camera? Or it says, well, I just stopped 3 people for a traffic stop, and I know you're a student, and I normally probably wouldn't write a student a ticket under certain circumstances because I may give discretion in some circumstances, but it looks bad. And then the law enforcement, someone pulls out tape and they say, hey, look at this law enforcement officer did what they're doing. So body cams are good, and sometimes they can harm you as well. But in cases where you're going to get sued, I would hope that you have a body cam to show that you only did what you needed to do in order to effect an arrest, and it wasn't malicious. And when it becomes malicious, it becomes criminal. So don't sue me because I had to take the bad guy prowling around your house and drag him out to the sidewalk. And unfortunately, he got caught up with the barbed wire that I didn't see, and now you want to just sue me for that negligence. And I'm very cautious in my attitude. You remember I was telling you about the hats? Well, you put on certain hats. So I thought as a rookie when I first came on, oh, you have to be nice to citizens and all that good stuff, until I went to this nice training. And then there's this guy, he says, my leg is broke, and he's crawling around his couch. And next thing you know, he pulls out a 38 and he begins to start shooting. So now my mentality is this: okay, your leg is broke, you need to stop crawling. So I'm going to drag you, and I use that term lightly because at this time I don't want to elaborate on it. And I'll take you out of your element so you will not find a gun in your house and you will not shoot me. And that's how real law enforcement officers do their job, based on their training and experience, where they could have gotten hurt. So I'm thankful for that training, the beginning training that I had, to say people in their houses, they know where all their guns are. So I'm not going to take a chance. So don't ask me why on my body camera, why I took this guy and drug him out the front door, just so that I can be safe for myself, because that's how I was trained, and it's real life training that happened. So to answer your question about qualified immunity, it should stay the same. So I'm not for changing anything as it relates to qualified immunity. As long as an officer performs their job and they're doing it with good faith, then they shouldn't be sued. So please don't take my kid's tricycle away and put me on Poor Street and take my personal assets. because something that I did in the performance of my duties as a law enforcement officer.
Okay, thank you. Next, we'll move to Mr. Darling.
Yes. So I do understand and agree with your assessment of qualified immunity. The Supreme Court made up qualified immunity whole cloth. I do think qualified immunity needs to go. And in the same way that attorneys and doctors have liability insurance, I believe that every deputy and every officer for that matter should carry their own liability insurance. And here's what happens. As sheriff, I would fully support funding those insurance policies for deputies for every year they do not have a claim on those policies. So what does that mean? If you have right now, the state of Florida caps what you can receive from a municipality at 200 grand. There are other instances where if there is malice, if there's additional negligence, wrongdoing, that those numbers can get higher than that, depending on what municipalities allow and depending on what the state allows. But as far as qualified immunity, I don't support it. And why an insurance system would work is because it is a system that if you do not have claims, you're going to be reimbursed for your policy from the sheriff's office. So the difference is when there is a claim, it's the policy holder, or it's the insurance company that's responsible for that payout and not the residents in the community. And I believe it was 2013 to 2019. There was more than $3 million paid out by the Orlando Police Department. I'm not positive on exactly which years it was, and I know all of that wasn't Sheriff Mina's time there at OPD, but OPD has a history, and I saw it at the Public Defender's Office when I worked there. And some of that cowboy mentality has transferred with the sheriff from OPD to the sheriff's office. And we have to change the culture, and I would support ending qualified immunity. Obviously, that's not going to be up to the sheriff. It's not even going to be up to the Florida legislature or the Florida Supreme Court. That's going to be up to the United States Supreme Court. And this last term that just ended, they decided not to take up any cases of qualified immunity. But I do believe that's something that's going to get taken up in the next couple of years. I don't support it. And I think moving to a policy position where deputies have their own insurance policies, because if they have multiple claims that end up getting paid out, deputy sheriffs even though OPD gets paid better than the sheriff's office, the deputies and the officers, the deputies don't make a lot of money. But if your insurance premium goes from $1,000 a year to $5,000 a year, at some point you're going to be priced out of the profession. And that is a way to ensure that those deputies that have continued claims against them are no longer employable, not just with the sheriff's office, but with any other law enforcement agency in the state.
Okay, thank you. And finally, we'll move over to Sheriff Mina.
Wow. So I think if we went that route, I don't think we would just have a bunch of officers not doing anything. The reason we have qualified immunity is because the men and women in law enforcement go out every single night and they risk their lives for the safety of our community. And us as a nation, we have realized that. And what we have also realized is many of those decisions that they make, unlike a lawyer, have to be made in a split second to save someone's life. So we afford them qualified immunity, but only when they are acting within the performance of their duties. And remember, qualified immunity is not absolute immunity. Qualified immunity has never stopped me from terminating an officer or deputy. Qualified immunity has never stopped me from arresting an officer or deputy. And qualified immunity, the judge doesn't always accept that. So in Orlando, for example, the judge only accepted the qualified immunity status in about 60 to 70% of the cases. So there were other cases where they came to me as chief, they're like, do you think that he was acting within the performance of his duties? I said, no, absolutely not. That's a crime. That officer was not acting within the performance of duties. And don't forget, we also have, we can also sue officers, law enforcement officers in state court. So qualified immunity is not absolute. It's not going to, like I said, it has not stopped me from terminating or disciplining an officer or a deputy. And the judges don't always accept qualified immunity because the officers or deputies are not always acting within the performance of the duties. But I think we need to keep it. I do think that a number of law enforcement officers will exit the profession. We will have trouble hiring people if they know they're not going to have certain protections when they have sworn oath to uphold the law and risk their lives for this community and have to make split-second decisions that a lot of people can't make or won't make. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. That was our final question for the night. I want to thank our 3 candidates for joining us, and also all of our attendees here on Zoom and also on our YouTube live stream. That live stream link will be available on our channel, which will be posted around various social medias. So feel free to go back and listen again or share it with anyone who wasn't able to make it. But that is all we have for you guys tonight. I will emphasize that the primary election coming up in August, the last day to register to vote by mail is August 8th. So obviously during the pandemic, that is a very good option for a lot of people. So I would suggest that we register to vote by mail and to vote in the election so that you could vote for one of these wonderful candidates. Or yeah, so thank you so much for joining us tonight and have a good one.
Thank you guys so much for having us.
Thank
Go
you.
Knights.